What's going on, everyone? So if you haven't seen my earlier ranked Joust tutorial video, I went over the basic idea of how the map is organized, good team comps and itemization, which included starter items. And the idea behind that video was to help inform you guys the best way I know how, as ranked Joust tutorial videos are far and few between, especially when comparing it to other game modes like Conquest. And I know how confused and daunting Joust was, as the best information on how to effectively play this game mode were based on nuggets of information picked up from gameplay videos. Well, now that we're on a new map, have starter items removed, and the meta team comps have changed, I think it's appropriate to make an update, as most of the information is outdated. So very similar to that video, I'm going to structure it the same way, with some different nuances geared more to this meta, as the recent changes to Joust shifted everything. Additionally, I'm going to be splitting this video into three main sections: the map layout / map tips, itemization, and effective team comps. There also should be some YouTube chapters on this video, but if not, you can always see the timestamps in the description if you'd like to skip to a specific section. And these videos take a lot of time and effort to make, so if you'd like to see more Jousts or overall analysis content, feel free to subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. But with all that out of the way, let's get straight into it. So with the change back to this map, the Season 3 Chinese map, we have a pretty small and narrow map, especially in the jungle area. But very quickly though, if you do not know anything about this map, I'm going to go over the major icons briefly. We have on each side one tower, one phoenix, and one titan, where the overall objective of the game is to kill the enemy's titan to win the game. We have the mana buff or the blue buff on each given side, that gives you passive MP5 when picked up. We have one purple buff that gives you 15% attack speed, as well as protection shred with auto attacks, and we have one red buff that gives you power and percent power based on the power you already have. And the final thing on the map is the Bull Demon King objective, which is adjacent to the purple buff. Now this objective is very unique, as this is essentially a giant buff camp that has a lot more health that once killed gives your team a collective buff. And this collective buff gives your team 4% health and 2% mana regen per 5 seconds. More importantly though, the Bull Demon King deactivates either the tower or the phoenix, whichever one is currently still up, for 90 seconds. And this allows for teams to siege towers and phoenixes without getting targeted, which also progresses the game if there's any type of stalemate. With that out of the way, let's go a little more in depth. First off, every single buff on the map spawns in at the same time, as soon as the game begins, or 10 seconds after the clock turns 0. Bull Demon King doesn't spawn in until 4 minutes into the game, so you don't have to worry about that. Knowing that, let's start off with the beginning phases of Joust, as there's an algorithm to how it properly works. After buying your items, both teams make their way over to red buff, where usually a small skirmish over this buff ensues. After this, both teams go to their wave and clear it, and then both go to their own blue buff. Following that, each team makes it back to the wave to clear it, and usually go over to purple buff, where similar to the red buff, each team fight over it. Now this is what each team does under a regular and ideal situation if each player is working together. However, a lot of times this doesn't happen. Another variation of this start goes pretty much like this. Both teams make their way to red, where both teams fight for this buff. Within this fight, one team gets damaged heavily and has to back up in order to not die. Now as they make their way back to their wave to clear, the team who gets red can make their way over to the other team's blue buff and steal it. From there, they can make their way to the wave to clear, then go to purple, and then finally their own blue, which pretty much starts an oppressive snowball right off the bat. With that, there are some ways to combat this. The first method is to simply go to your blue buff and secure it, while giving up red to the other team. Now this isn't an ideal situation, but it's better than not getting any buff at all. And this also puts you in a better situation, as you can now potentially steal their blue, as both teams will be at full health at the wave. Another method, and my preferred way, is to make your way over to purple buff at the beginning of the game. Most teams make their way to red buff and usually will gladly take it unprovoked. So essentially, each team is doing red and purple as their first buff, making the XP and gold accumulation even between teams. Where now each team makes their way to the wave at full health so that you can each get your blue buffs, or at the very least have enough health to defend your blue. This is also a less riskier play as there's a 50-50 chance of getting red, with the added potential of getting 0 farm on the map. And that pretty much wraps up the beginning stages of the game. After this, most teams do the buff camps as soon as they respawn, and the respawn timer for each buff is 3 minutes. But this segues into my next main point, which is to farm everything on the map effectively, efficiently, and with teamwork in mind. Making sure to clear your wave and buff camps as soon as possible, usually as soon as they come up, is how you make sure you get your levels, as well as gold for your items. For example, instead of trying to fight an enemy team where there isn't any kill potential, you should be doing your blue buff that recently spawned, as you're losing valuable farm by letting it sit there. And this is especially important as buff camp's respawn timer only starts after you kill the buff camp. Additionally, making sure you get all the minion wave is crucial, as that's your main source of gold and XP. So although buff camps are a pivotal part of your XP and gold, try not to sacrifice a wave for your blue buff, for example. Instead, do your wave, and then do your buff camps, as this is the most effective and efficient way to maximize your gold and XP. But that pretty much wraps up everything about this section. And for more nuanced Joust tips, I'll be making a video coming up soon, going over 10 things that you can do to help you win more games in Joust. Or if I've already made it, go check my channel to see if it's up. But with that out of the way, let's move into our next section, team compositions. So in Joust, there are only 2 general types of team comps. So if you've seen my last ranked Joust tutorial video, the idea is roughly the same. Where there is the 2 tank followed by 1 damage dealer team comp, and the 1 tank and 2 damage dealer team comp. But with that being said, what was once the king of Joust is no longer anymore, and that is the 2 tank, 1 damage dealer team comp. Where now it's the traditional team comp that really shines comparatively. And here is the proof. Right here you'll see a picture of the highest pick rate followed by the highest win rate. And as you can see, the first 2 team comps have 1 tank and 2 damage dealers, which have far higher pick rates when compared to the 2 tank and 1 damage dealer team comp, and also has a higher win rate. So unlike last tutorial, it seems that the overall best team comp is the 1 tank and 2 damage dealer team. However, with the recent changes making damage items less potent, this might change and make the double tank team comp better in the near future, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But with that out of the way, let's get into the visuals of what these 2 general team comps look like. So like I said, you have your 2 general team comps, 2 tank and 1 damage dealer, and the 1 tank and 2 damage dealers. Now the 2 classes that usually take up the 2 roles for the tank role is Guardian and Warrior. And usually it's a combination of both Guardian and Warrior, and in some cases Assassins can fit this role too, and in other cases the tank role can be filled by the same role, i.e. 2 Warriors, or 2 Guardians, or even 2 Assassins. And following that, the damage dealer role is usually going to be a mage, but can also be a hunter too. However, one thing to note is that you need at least 1 god that has a different typing that is either magical or physical, as having 3 gods with the same typing already puts you at a massive disadvantage. And this type of team comp is pretty all over the place, as you can have different types of combinations. And here are some example team comps you are most likely to see. 1 Warrior, 1 Guardian, 1 Mage, 2 Guardians, 1 Hunter, 2 Warriors, 1 Mage, or even 1 Guardian, 1 Assassin, 1 Mage. And one thing to note, if you're playing this team comp, I would suggest building one of your tanks more with damage, as you're most likely going to be going up against a team comp with 2 damage dealers, so you're going to need someone to disrupt that backline. Otherwise, you're probably not going to compete as well. And now moving on to arguably the best team comp in this meta, we have 1 tank and 2 damage dealers. And in this meta, the 2 classes that usually take the tank role is Guardian and Warrior. Now Assassins can take this tank role, but there are only a few Assassins that really get success at being an effective tank. And even still, those specific gods like Neja get banned frequently. So usually, the Warrior and Guardian take this role. And then within the 2 damage dealers, they're pretty invariable, with both roles being occupied by a mage and a hunter. And the reasoning for why this team comp is the best is due to 3 main things. The first thing is the new rotation of maps foster a narrower map, allowing for hunters to almost always be close to their team. And the second thing is that they added a new purple buff giving attack speed and protection shred. And finally, the third thing, there has been an overall nerf to all tanks, involving the loss of starter items and tower buffs, to name a few examples. But going back to this team comp, there are a couple of distinctions I want to make clear about the tank roles. One thing I highlighted in my last tutorial video is the idea that not all tanks are good in Joust, and this is still very present, especially in this meta as you only have one tank. So the main idea behind a tank in this meta is to set up damage as well as peel for your backliners. While in previous patches, you were more or less always having two tanks that could set up and peel for your team, so the onus wasn't only on one tank. Well, now it pretty much is. And this is why picking a tank that can have great setup and damage while having great peel is going to be a key to victory. And it's no wonder why gods like Atlas, Bacchus, and Sobek are the best tanks in Joust, as they have tremendous setup, damage, and peel. So making sure you have these attributes within a tank will make winning a game that much easier. Now don't get me wrong, you can still pick gods that do great oppressive damage while being tanky, like a Guan Yu or a Kukulkan for example, and still win the game. But if you don't have consistent CC abilities, setup, and peel, it's going to be a lot harder, so please keep that in mind. So like last tutorial, let's go into some example team comps and analyze why they are good and or potentially bad. Starting off with the 2 tank, 1 damage dealer team comp, we have Bacchus, Fenrir, and Persephone. Now this is a very oppressive team comp that has high CC, high peel, and high damage, with all of these gods having great getaway abilities. This is an all-around great team comp as Bacchus sets up for damage, while Fenrir tries to backline the mage or ADC, and of course Persephone does damage in the back. Now let's take a look at a not so good team comp, where we have a Surtur, Fafnir, and a Nox. Now all around, most of these gods are not very good in Joust, as Surtur doesn't have great CC, as well as him being able to dive the backline is unlikely. Fafnir doesn't have great or consistent setup, or damage outside of his ult, and in this meta, hunters are going to absolutely obliterate him. And finally, with Nox, she has a great damage and counter ability with her bubble, but her abilities are hard to hit, as well as she is better suited as a hybrid tank rather than a damage dealer. Now with that being said, you can still obviously win with this team comp, but you're disadvantaging yourself while giving your enemy team a handicap. And now moving into traditional team comp examples, we have Ganesha, Xbalanque, and Baba Yaga. Now like I said with this team comp, the tank should be able to have good CC and high damage, which Ganesha has, all while having great damage and getaway abilities with Baba Yaga and Xbalanque. Now what makes a bad team comp really relies on the tank. For example, a team with Jormungandr, Skadi, and Freya. Jormungandr has great damage, but he lacks consistent setup and peel ability. Additionally, Skadi and Freya aren't good as their getaway abilities aren't consistent, along with a relatively long period of getting online. So overall, this is a very lackluster team. And this pretty much sums up the team comp section in a general sense. And if you've seen my last tutorial, most of what I've said here mimics this section, outside of the meta changes, as team comps are pretty stable in the game mode, regardless as to what changes, knock on wood. And what I mean by that is the 2 general team comps, like we're never going to see 2 hunters, 1 mage comp. But if you'd like to see more in-depth videos on team comps, I have a team comp video right here to click on if you haven't already seen it, and I plan on making more in the future. So in this section, I'm going to go over the general items that are in the meta when playing a specific class like Tank, Mage, and ADC. And I'll be going over why they're good, as well as pointing out some situational items I go within that class too. So basically, this section will go over the core items you will be most likely buying within a specific role. But please keep in mind that although I'm going to be as general as possible, all items are dependent on what Hi-Rez decides to do, so depending on the meta, some of this may not apply. So starting off with our first class, we're going to take a look at the tank role. And the first item/items you should almost always build is Gauntlet of Thebes or Prophetic Cloak. These 2 items are essentially your non-negotiable items you should almost always buy when you're playing the tank, unless you're playing hybrid, and even then, building it is almost necessary unless you're rushing an item like Cannonier's Cuirass, which we'll be talking about soon. But both Gauntlet of Thebes and Prophetic Cloak both have ridiculous stats when fully stacked, with Gauntlet of Thebes giving you 45 of each protections, as well as an aura that gives you and your teammates an extra 10 of each protections. and Prophetic Cloak that gives you 40 of each protection, 10% cooldown, and a passive that gives an aura of 20 protections each to you and your teammates. Additionally, this gives you percent mitigation as well, depending on how much protections you have. Now, some tanks could hypothetically build into both, giving you a tremendous amount of stats so you can build damage items later on. But only a few gods can really get away with it, like Kuzumbo for example. But most of the time it's not worth, as building 2 stacking items takes way too long to get online, meaning you're pretty squishy for a while. So for the most part, you should either be building Gauntlet of Thebes or Prophetic Cloak. But how do you decide which one is more worth to go? Well, the main difference between these two items is the stacking difference, where Gauntlet of Thebes requires you to be near a wave, getting an assist, while Prophetic requires you to deal damage to gods to get stacks. So with that in mind, if you're a god that can get these stacks really easy, like Kuzumbo or Atlas for example, then Prophetic Cloak is the one you should go into. But if you're a god that doesn't get these stacks from Prophetic Cloak easily, like Ganesha for example, then it might be better to go into a Gauntlet of Thebes. Additionally, picking between these two items also depends on what their team comp is. For example, if they have a traditional team comp, Mage, ADC, and Tank, and that tank is a Guardian, it might be hard to reliably get stacks on the ADC, depending on what god you have, as you need to get 15 stacks on physical gods and 15 stacks on magical gods, so this is just as important as well. Now moving on, the next item to pay attention to is Cannoneer's Cuirass, and I would probably add an asterisk to this item as I don't think it's necessary to build every time. This item is very new, especially with its most recent changes that incentivize players to build it early, right before you build your Thebes or Prophetic Cloak, or vice versa. With it giving you 25 of each protection, 250 health, 20 HP 5, and a passive that gives your allies 15 bonus gold upon hitting an enemy lane minion, it's no wonder why that people are building this early. Now this item is particularly good in Joust as the gold given to players will almost always be procced, seeing as you're almost always near allies. And this can allow for your mage and ADC to get items online faster, allowing for a bigger snowball. Similar to how Sentinel's gift gave extra gold per minion, Cannoneer's Cuirass sort of mimics this, but instead it benefits allies more. So essentially, Cannoneers sort of takes the place of Sentinel's gift since they remove starter items. And with it costing an extremely cheap 2,000 gold, you can get this item basically within a minute of the game. But in order for this item to work properly, you need to prioritize hitting the minions. And finally, with this being a new item, things are likely to change in terms of the meta, and whether high-res changes this item. Next up, we have Emperor's Armor. This item has 50 physical protections, 250 health, and increases your allied structure's attack speed by 30%, and reduces enemy structure's attack speed by 30% as well. Now this item will usually be built either early game, midway through the game, or if you see your enemies building Emp Armor to try and counter it. With the recent changes to towers and phoenixes, adding a percent pen debuff to you as you get hit by them, this incentivizes building this item even more, as being able to tower dive is a lot harder than it once was. So this can allow your tank to survive a little longer if you're trying to siege. Additionally, on the opposite side, if you're the one defending your tower, or Phoenix, building Emperor's Armor can dissuade your enemy from stepping even an inch into your tower, allowing you to have a sort of pressure if you're losing. Or if you wanted to build a team around this, having Emp Armor and a god like Fenrir can be really oppressive. And even if the enemy team buys Emp Armor to counter yours, you still force them to build this item. Now moving on, I'm going to take a page from my other Joust tutorial video and name this part of the core item section the MP5/cooldown/protection type, as this part hasn't really changed. Now I'm going to be pointing towards different items, but this section is dependent on the damage type you're trying to build protections for. For example, building physical defense against a 2 physical, 1 magical god team comp, as well as prioritizing MP5 and cooldown within those specific items. So with that being said, the first item I need to point out before moving into the real items further within this build is Mystical Earring. And to be absolutely clear, you do not need to build this item halfway through your build. You build this as your first item as it gives you 15 MP5. I wanted to add this in here as it fits this section more, but essentially, as a tank, you're most likely running out of mana after a few abilities as your MP5 is bad early game. And so this item easily relieves this when built first or second item, but preferably first. And then later on you sell this. But with that out of the way, let's move into magical defense items that fit this section. So the first item is Genji's Guard, which gives you 100 health, 60 magical protections, 40 MP5, and 10% cooldown, with a passive that essentially gives you even more cooldown when taking magical damage from abilities. And you usually build this more often than most of the other items within this tree, as its stats mostly outshine the others. Next up, we have Oni Hunter's Garb, giving you 150 health, 50 magical protections, 30 MP5, and 20% crowd control reduction, and a passive that gives you upwards of 9% damage mitigation. And finally, within this tree, we have Shogun's Kusari, which gives you 40 magical protections, 100 health, 20 MP5, and 10% cooldown, with a passive that gives you and your allies within 70 units 30% attack speed. And you're going Shogun's Kusari if you have an auto attack based team, as its passive really helps out those auto attack gods. But when in doubt, build Genji's Guard, especially if you're an assassin or warrior. Now moving on to more team assisting items, we have Heart Ward Amulet, which gives you 45 magical protections, 200 health, and a passive that gives you and your team 15 extra magical protections and 30 extra MP5. Additionally, you can upgrade it to Amulet of the Stronghold, giving yourself even more protections. And as far as the other upgrade goes, it's currently bad, so don't even pay attention to it. But this item shines specifically if you're trying to assist your team more rather than yourself. So for example, if you're a Guardian trying to help your team stay alive, you would go Heart Ward Amulet, upgrading it into an Amulet of the Stronghold later in the game. And outside of that, these are the 4 main magical protection items you should be focusing on. Now moving on to the physical items, we really don't have a lot to choose from here, but items like Gladiator's Shield, which gives you physical protections, 150 health, 25 HP5, 10% cooldown, and a passive that gives you extra damage based on how many protections you have. And then we have Breastplate of Valor, giving you 55 physical protections, 300 mana, 10 MP5, 20% cooldown reduction, and an ability to go into Breastplate of Determination or Breastplate of Vigilance. And as far as which upgrade to go into, most of the time I would go into Determination, as it gives you more protections corresponding to what you're being hit by, while Vigilance is too niche in my opinion, reducing auto attack damage by 15% when casting your ultimate. And the last item I'd like to talk about is Pridwen and its recent glyphs. And this item gives you 25 of each protection, 20% cooldown reduction, and a passive that gives you a shield once you cast your ultimate, which later blows up once destroyed or times out. And this item really shines with its passive and large amounts of cooldown, as it's really good on gods who proc their ultimate a lot, like Kukulkan. But with the newest glyphs, this item has become one of the best items in general, with Glorious Pridwen giving you essentially the same exact thing with its passive, except allowing you to explode it 2 times. And Reverend Pridwen giving you a similar passive, however you are a lot tankier as the passive gives you a larger shield. Now both of these glyphs are OP, and if you were to buy either or, you're still getting amazing stats. But the difference in which one to go is based on whether or not you want to do more damage with Glorious Pridwen or have more survivability with Reverent Pridwen. But outside of that, this is pretty much it for this section. But overall, which item you preferably build here will ultimately depend on who you're going up against. For example, if the enemy team has 2 physical gods and 1 magical, you may want to build into a Gladiator's Shield or Breastplate of Valor. Or if the enemy team has 2 magical gods and 1 physical god, you may want to build into a Genji's Guard or Heart Ward Amulet for instance. But now I want to highlight a few items that are good, but are dependent on what god you're playing. The first one is Phalanx, which gives you an array of stats like physical defense, health, and crowd control reduction. But its passive can give you up to 30% attack speed and 21 of each protection when hit by auto attacks. And this is exemplified by the fact that minions get this buff too, but at double the effect. So essentially, minions can get up to 60% attack speed and 42 of each protection, which can easily help with taking a tower or Phoenix. But with this item, it really only fits gods that are auto attack based, like Bellona, Bomana, or even a Gilgamesh. Also, Berserker's Shield within this auto attack context is a very good pickup as well. And then we have Breastplate of Regrowth, that gives you physical protections, MP5, mana, and cooldown, which is a lot of bloated stats for how cheap it is. But its passive is what really makes it shine, giving you movement speed and power when healing yourself with an ability. Now if you're a god like Neja, perk, or tier for example, you always need to build this item, preferably early game, like after a Gauntlet of Thieves or a Prophetic Cloak, as this item is way too good for gods that can reliably heal themselves. And before we move on to the last items you build, I want to highlight anti-heal and anti-crit. If there's significant healing on the enemy team, building items like Pestilence and Contagion are necessary and should be built right around middle way through your build, and should be prioritized. Similarly, if the enemy hunter or even assassin is building into crit items, prioritizing spectral armor is absolutely necessary, as it reduces crit to you and your teammates by 30%, but also gives you extra power. And this is especially good in Joust, as for the most part you're always within 55 units for his passive to work. But finally, moving on to the last items, I like to call this section the whatever you want. If you feel like you need more defense or utility, items like Spirit Robe can help, as it gives you 35 of each protection, 10% cooldown, and damage mitigation in its passive. If you have consistent crowd control abilities like Atlas for example, you can build into a Stone of Binding, giving you 35 of each protection, while essentially giving you flat penetration when you hit a god with a crowd control ability. If you feel like you're lacking power for physical gods, items like Heartseeker or flat pen items like Brawler's Beatstick can be built here, and for magical gods, items like Soul Reaver, Ethereal Staff, or even a Chronos Pendant are good here too. With all of your items that you built early in mid-game involving protections, MP5, and cooldown, your last items can be up to what you feel like you need, whether it's more protections and utility, or flat pen or percent pen. At the end of the day, you have a lot of options here. And then very quickly, I wanted to go over Hybrid Assassin. Now this class can sort of work for warriors as well, but pretty much are exclusive to assassins. When building this class, always make sure to build at the very least one defense item, either Gauntlet of Thieves or Prophetic Cloak, or any item corresponding to the damage type you think is going to cause you the most trouble. And make sure you either build this the very first item, or somewhat towards early to mid game if you're building a Breastplate of Valor or Genji's Guard for example. Building defense into damage is usually how you want to build hybrid gods. And then after that, you can build damage items like Flat Pen if they have two backline gods, for example a Jotun's Wrath or a Brawler's Beatstick. And then you would want to build percent pen items like Heartseeker, Hydra's Lament, and Serrated Edge for the tanks. Additionally, with the newest changes, you can build hybrid assassins like they once were, where in the previous patches you built a few tank items and a few damage items. And this is good as well, especially on CC heavy gods like Fenrir, Neja, and Serket for instance. There are some gods that benefit from more damage oriented builds like Bastet and Camazotz, but there are other gods that benefit more from this tankier line of build like Fenrir and Neja for example. So building items like Gauntlet of Thebes, Fridwin, Gladiator's Shield, and Stone of Binding, and finishing the build with damage items like Jotun's Wrath / Brawler's Beatstick and Heartseeker is an example build that also works for hybrid assassins and is conducive towards the recent changes. Now let's talk about items you build on mages. Now before I go in depth, I want to point out that most of the mages that are good in Joust are the burst mages, that do a lot of damage with their abilities. Mages that are built differently like ADC mages, like Freya, or hybrid mages like Ao Kuang or Nox, or even lifesteal mages like Anubis or Hades won't fully apply as this section targets the majority of mages, which is burst mages. But if you'd like, you can always stop by my stream and ask me about a specific god, or I can make a separate video going over all the gods that don't have a straightforward build path, whether it's mages, hunters, or tanks like warriors and guardians. But moving on from that, let's talk about the first core item that you almost always build, and that is Chronos Pendant. With the removal of starter items, Sands of Time is no longer allowed to be built, and this affects all mages, as it gave you really good MP5 with 10% cooldown, which is invaluable for a mage early game. Well, Chronos Pendant is an early game utility item that fills this role. With it giving you 20% cooldown and MP5, this allows you to use your abilities more frequently, without the issue of running out of mana quickly. Also, before moving on, being able to buy tier 2 of Chronos Pendant is also valuable, as it gives you 15 MP5 right off the bat. So this is an extra tidbit of information a lot of people overlook. Now the next set of items that you should almost always build is Spear of Desolation into Divine Rune, or vice versa if the enemy team has a lot of healing, as Divine Rune has anti-heal. But with Spear of Desolation having 70 magical power, 15 magical penetration, and 10% cooldown, and Divine Ruin having 70 power and 15 magical penetration, these stats are exceptionally good at doing damage to enemies' backline, as flat penetration bursts down gods who don't build protections. And this is especially important now, as we are currently in a Joust meta that is dictated by a hunter, mage, and tank, meaning you're getting a lot more value out of flat pen items. Now before I move on to the next core item, I want to point out what you do if there happens to be 2 tanks and 1 damage dealer. So like I said earlier, that having double flat pen items are really good at bursting down backline targets, like hunters and mages that don't build protections. Well, if the enemy team happens to have 2 tanky characters, building flat pen items aren't as valuable. And this is because a flat amount of protections being taken off a tank that has around 200 to 300 protections isn't all that significant. This is where percent penetration items come in, and in correlation, health damage related items like Soul Reaver also follow suit. So if they have a 2 tank team comp, instead of building double flat pen items, you should build percent pen items to counter them, like a Spear of the Magus, Rod of Tahuti, Doom Orb, or even a Charon's Coin. So essentially, the very basic formula on when to decide when to build flat pen and when to build percent pen is this. If their team has 2 backline characters not building protections, prioritizing flat pen is the go-to items, where if their team has 2 tanks and 1 backline, building percent pen and health damage related items should be prioritized. But for the most part in this current meta, you're going to be building flat pen more frequently. Now moving into the next item, we have Soul Reaver. And this item has 65 power, 300 mana, and a passive that deals an additional 1% of target's maximum health as magical damage, and scales up the more health the enemy has. And this item should be built around the mid-section of the game, as its passive should start doing a lot more damage around this time. And this is because of a couple things. So the first one is that with every level you gain, you're also gaining health. So as the game goes on, the more health you receive means the more damage Soul Reaver does. And the second thing is, it's around this time where tanks have built a few items that most likely give them extra health, meaning Soul Reaver should scale damage around this time. So building Soul Reaver around the 4th item is a very good power spike. Finally, moving on to the last couple items, this part of the build is as strict as the prior ones, as for the most part you want to build damage items that preferably have percent pen, and there are a lot of options here. For the most part, however, one of these item slots should be Rod of Tahuti, as it gives you 100 magical power, 30 MP5, 10% magical penetration, and a passive that deals an additional 15% additional magical power against targets below 60% health. But overall, it's a very expensive item, so this kind of levels out the bigger stats that it gives. But as for the upgraded glyph versions, you can go either one as they're both good. If you want extra burst damage when hitting a god with an ability, I suggest going Calamitous Rod. And if you'd like more movement speed with 1.5 seconds off cooldown when hitting a god a second time with your abilities, then you should go Perfected Rod. Other than that, items like Spear of the Magus, which gives you magical power, magical lifesteal, and 10% magical penetration, or Staff of Mirrodin, which gives you magical power, 10% magical pen, 10% cooldown with a passive that gives you even more power, or even a Doom Orb, which gives you magical power, 10% magical penetration, and movement speed with a passive that gives you even more movement speed and more magical power. So at the end of the day, your later items are pretty much endless, as a lot of these items fit this category. Just keep in mind, your last item slots should be prioritizing percent pen and high raw damage, or at the very least a very good passive like Staff of Mirrodin. And one last thing before moving on to the hunter builds, if you're a mage and you keep dying by a specific god class, it's okay to build one protection item to sort of alleviate this. For example, if you have an assassin and a hunter that keep punishing you, building a Breastplate of Valor can be helpful in this situation. And finally, in my opinion, the best class in Joust right now, we have hunters. And very similar to mages and tanks, the build is meta dependent, but with hunters in Joust, there aren't that many build path options. So with that being said, there are 2 main hunter classes, ability and auto attack based. And for most hunters, they're falling under the auto attack base, so let's start with this build path first. But really quickly before that, I need to go over crit. Generally speaking, crit is not good in Joust. And this might seem counterintuitive, especially in this Joust meta, as you can easily burst down the enemy mage and hunters with ease. However, with the recent buff to Spectral Armor now allowing its passive to apply to your teammates On top of getting power by getting hit by a crit, this makes crit pretty much useless most of the time. So for most situations, building crit is best. Now moving into the hunter items, there are several good starts you can go, but the main items you should be focusing on when choosing should be Transcendence, Devourer's Gauntlet, Griffin Wing, and Aussie. Now you can mix and match a lot of these items, but overall all of these items are very good on all auto attack based gods. But let's move into each item and explain when you should prioritize a specific item. Starting off with both Trans and Devourer's Gauntlet. Devourer's Gauntlet, when fully stacked, has 50 physical power, 15 physical penetration, and 15% physical lifesteal. While Transcendence, when fully stacked, has 25 physical power, 1050 mana, 10 MP5, and 10% cooldown reduction, with a passive that converts 2% of your mana into physical power. Now both of these items are good options, as they each give good stats when fully stacked. I would say that the preference on which one to go would be based on how each god benefits from the stats. For example, if you're playing Xbalanque, who uses a lot of mana and deals good damage with his abilities, you should probably prioritize Transcendence. But if you're playing Rama, who relies solely on his auto attacks doing damage, then Devourer's Gauntlet is probably the play here. Also, picking one of these two items dictates what your next item will be. One thing that is important with hunters is lifesteal self-sustain. So if you choose Devourer's Gauntlet, you pretty much have all the lifesteal you need, whereas if you pick Transcendence, you don't have any sustain, meaning you either forfeit it or go into an Aussie next item. Now going Aussie after building Transcendence is a good build, but this highlights the trade-offs you need to pay attention to. And this brings us to our next item, which is Aussie. And this item has 40 physical power, 12% physical lifesteal, and 20% attack speed, with a passive that gives you an extra 15% physical lifesteal when below 50% health. And this item is still a very good option to build, as it still has good power and a clutch passive in situations where you have low HP. And Aussie is usually built early on for self-sustain. Like I said earlier, usually after Transcendence or Griffin Wing, or even if you're feeling like you don't need stacking items, you can build this item first. And then our final early build item we have is Griffin Wing, which has 40 physical power, or 60 magical power, 30% attack speed, 15 MP5, and a passive that increases your basic attack projectile speed by 40%. One thing to note about this item is its early MP5 stat. This is really good early game, as you tend to use a lot of mana regardless of what class you are. So if you think you're going to need early mana sustain for early game pressure, this might be a go-to start you might like. But with that, and its high base power and cheap cost, this is almost always built within your first 3 item slots, and should always be built on long-range auto gods like Hashiman, Ishtar, and Xbalanque because of its passive. So some build examples you can go based on these 4 items is this. You could go Transcendence into Aussie, Devourer's Gauntlet into Griffin Wing, or Griffin Wing into Aussie. Also, it's better to not mix Aussie with Devourer's Gauntlet to try and min-max your lifesteal. Now moving on to our next 2 items, we have Executioner and Kin Size. Executioner has 30 physical power, 20% attack speed, and a passive that reduces physical protections by upwards of 28%. And this is a very good item for you to do extra damage to backline gods, but especially against tanks. And not only that, but it's really cheap, so building it early helps you get online a lot faster. And with this item, it has upgrades as well, which is the Heavy Executioner, which gives you the ability to reduce your enemy's protections by 30%, but only allows your auto attack speed to be 1.9, and keep in mind the cap is 2.5. And the Ferocious Executioner gives you upwards of 20% increased damage on an enemy target, based on you hitting them or them hitting you. So to keep things short and simple, Ferocious Executioner is usually the go-to, as auto attack speed being capped at 1.9 isn't worth it, especially seeing as 20% increased damage outshines Percent Pen. And next up is Kin Size, which gives you 30 physical power, 25% attack speed, and a passive very similar to Soul Reaper, which gives you physical damage equal to 1.5% of the target's maximum health, and scales up the more health the enemy has. Now this item is usually built later in the build, around the 4th item slot, as it costs a lot of gold, as well as its passive scaling a lot better the later the game goes. But Kins does a lot of extra damage with its passive, especially to gods who build health related items. But with last season's changes to all gods' health, increasing them, as well as the constant buffs, Kins shreds through any god innately. So with all the auto attack based hunters, you should almost always pick up this item. Then next up we have Dominant, which has 40 physical power, 200 mana, 20 MP5, and 15% attack speed, with a passive that allows your basic attacks to benefit from an additional 20% physical penetration. And this item is seemingly a no-brainer, due to its passive being directly correlated with hunters. So basically, it's a pen item with high damage, attack speed. What more do you need? But preferably you want to build this later on, as the previous items are currently more important to get online sooner. And the final item you should be prioritizing is going to be very similar to the tank section, and that is a variety of items. Some example items you can go is Odysseus's bow, as it has a 4 auto chain, allowing for more extra damage applying to a lot of enemies nearby. You could also go Crusher, which has high base power, with some physical penetration, with a good passive applying to your abilities. You could even go Titan's Bane, which gives you a lot of base power, as well as some really good percent pen. So there are a lot of options here, and specifically, one thing you need to identify is what your god thrives better with. Specifically calling back to my earlier example with Xbalanque and Rama, where Rama would benefit better with Silver Branch, as Rama has an auto attack stim in his second ability, allowing for its passive to work, where Xbalanque might benefit off of a Crusher due to his abilities applying extra damage. But overall, that's pretty much it in terms of auto attack hunters. Let's finally move into the ability-based hunter. Now comparing it to auto attack hunters, there aren't many true ability-based hunters. The main ones are Marticarus, Amuzin-Kab, Skadi, Ullr, and Chiron. Outside of that, you could maybe argue Neith and Medusa, but they build a mix of both types of builds. So with that in mind, I'm going to quickly go into the items you should be building, and that is Transcendence, Jotun's Wrath, Crusher, Dominance, and Heartseeker. You can mix in a few different items like Kins, Titan's Bane, or even Bloodforge for your last item. So starting with Transcendence, like I've gone over earlier, this item gives a lot of power and mana when fully stacked, which is exactly what you need as an ability-based damage dealer, as you're spamming out abilities. Additionally, Jotun's Wrath gives you that cheap base damage and mana while giving you the ability to upgrade it into Jotun's Vigor or Jotun's Cunning. And to keep things short, Jotun's Cunning is the go-to upgrade, as it gives you even more cooldown with your abilities. And then moving into Crusher, its base power and passive allows you to have even higher damage while also giving you a little bit of attack speed and percent pen, which is always nice to have. And then moving on to the last two items, we have Dominance, which similarly gives you that high damage and attack speed with the added percent pen in your autos. And finally, Heartseeker, which gives you really high base power with percent pen and a passive that allows you to do even more damage based on how much health your enemy has, very similar to Soul Reaver or Kins. So overall, what you would expect with ability-based hunters. And so early game, you're looking for cooldown, mana, and power with Transcendence and Jotun's Wrath, and a lot of power and penetration with the following 4 items. However, every ability-based hunter is not built the same. For example, Hydra's Lament is a very good pickup for Ullr, but isn't that great of an item on Chiron. And similarly, Kins is a great pickup on Amuzin-Kab, but a very poor pickup for Ullr. So unlike auto attack based gods, there tends to be a lot of variability within the ability based god pool, so you need to pay attention to that as well. But that pretty much wraps up the fundamentals on how you should build, as well as what items you should be paying attention to based on each class type. Also, I know that I speak very fast or move on to subjects really quickly, so if you ever need to put on captions, or slow down the video, or whatever else, I really suggest that you do. But that's pretty much the general idea of how to properly play ranked Joust. Now, I didn't cover every nuance or every little minute detail, as there are a lot more in-depth, complicated differences that would make a general tutorial more convoluted. But if you made it to the end, I really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed it or learned something new, feel free to like and subscribe, as I plan on making more of these type of videos, whether it's ranked Joust or Conquest, or anything new that's happening to Smite. But other than that, stay safe, and thank you guys for watching.